million for school housing aid. We don't spend it all, and any amount remaining goes into the School Building Authority Capital Fund. Because of the growth in school construction and the fact that we've level funded that $80 million figure, this year we anticipate spending more than $80 million on housing aid. The significance of that is that there won't be any money left for the School Building Authority Capital Fund. Partially for that reason, the governor suggests putting $50 million of the $250 million issuance into the School Building Authority Capital Fund. He does that because the SBA Capital Fund funds some of the smaller PAYGO projects, a roof repair, HVAC, envelope, whereas that $250 million bond fund, or in this case $200 million, that tends to fund new construction of large projects like new construction of an entire school or a major renovation. The $50 million will be effectively set aside for smaller improvements. In higher education, the governor, his interest in supporting the green and blue economy intersects with the priorities of URI in the Narragansett Bay campus, so he dedicates $50 million to that priority. And then CCRI, this is the second time that CCRI has been on the ballot. Those are system-wide improvements across CCRI campuses. It's not a specific project per se, but it's in general improving the quality of their capital facilities. Rick isn't left out. You saw that with the opportunity of the Capital Project Fund, that project was thoughtfully constructed and will to help take advantage of the Capital Projects Fund. And I know that DOA PRO will continue working with them to ensure that that is a viable and eligible project for Capital Projects Fund. And then finally, a green bond, the Green Economy Bond. This funds many familiar programs that include partnerships between DEM and the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. I think that covers it. I'll pass it off to Brian for operating budget proposals.
Thank you, Joe. Been talking for an hour now, and we're just now getting to the fiscal year 23 budget, which gives you an indication of the complexity of the budget this year. So when we're looking at the fiscal year 23 budget, again, the governor's focus was really on economic growth and making sure that we are improving Rhode Islanders' lives, we are creating jobs, and really trying to do this in a fiscally restrained fashion. There are not a lot of new program expansions, not a lot of new benefits, primarily because we need to make sure that we're focusing on delivering the promises of the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, that our agencies are executing on that. We don't want to create new out-year obligations because the governor is very keen on making sure that we are not exploding the size of government and that we are trying to be responsible with taxpayer dollars. So a lot of the decisions in the fiscal year 23 budget are consistent with that, and I will go through them. The first item, which has been discussed already, is the small business package, so I'll go through this relatively quickly. But small businesses are the job creators in Rhode Island, and the governor, as a former small business owner, knows what small business need. He works a lot with small business organizations, and these items are things that came up through those conversations, came up through Rhode Island 2030 conversations. So this is a small business package which collectively will help improve the regulatory outlook and provide additional assistance to small businesses. It reduces the corporate minimum tax to $375, currently at $400. Creates a taxpayer steward position within the Division of Taxation. So as there are changes to Rhode Island tax law, there will be someone that individuals and businesses can turn to help explain what those are. It allows cities and towns to create an exemption in tangible property tax. As many of you know, businesses have to pay tax on the value of their business property. So if it's a pizza oven or if it's office equipment, those are taxed as tangible items. And it's a relatively burdensome process for cities and towns and for small businesses. The taxes are relatively small, but they have to make an inventory of what their property is, what the depreciation schedule is, and they get a bill for that property. Unfortunately, if cities and towns want to create an exemption, they have to go to the General Assembly for specific legislation. So the governor proposes giving cities and towns the ability to set their own exemptions, to say if we want to exclude the first $2,000, $5,000 of property, they would be able to do that. That's important, especially important for our small businesses. It reduces the interest rate for taxes, for delinquent taxes, late payments on taxes, particularly income and corporate. Those are some of the small business taxes that people will pay. Small businesses often pay through individual income taxes. And the interest rates in Rhode Island are much higher than our neighbors. We are currently 18%. Connecticut's is 12%. The governor proposes bringing that down to be in line with our neighbors. It repeals the sunset provision on liquor to go, so restaurants and brew pubs will be able to continue offering alcoholic beverages with to-go items. That's important for our restaurants. Allowing people who have small businesses related to baked goods, if they make brownies or cakes, they would be able to do that from their kitchens without having to go through the very complicated regulatory process that Department of Health currently allows. So they could, if they have less than $25,000 of sales, they could use their home kitchens for this type of activity. They would just need to go through a safety process, a safety training with the Department of Health and get a license for it. There is an expansion to the Small Business Development Fund, which is a tax credit proposal, a tax credit program for companies that invest in Rhode Island businesses. And the proposal here is to expand that to make sure it is available to other types of lenders, community lenders, lenders in Rhode Island, some with mission-driven goals, and making sure that those funds support those types of institutions. And the last item on this list is exempting from sales tax the trade-in value of motorcycles. Currently, if you are a car owner and you go and trade in your car, you do not need to pay sales tax on the value of that trade-in. However, that is not true for trucks, for motorcycles, and for trailers. So the governor proposes expanding the existing exemption on sales tax for passenger vehicles to also include motorcycles. Next item is on Act on Climate. There are a few items in the budget related, in the operating budget related to the Act on Climate. Some of you were at the press conference yesterday where the governor spoke about the broader components of climate in his budget, but he is sincere about making sure that we hit the Act on Climate's goals of having net zero emissions by 2050. So the major proposal here is that it would transfer $6 million from the Energy Efficiency Fund specifically to work on, for the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, the EC4, to allow the EC4 to start moving forward on Act on Climate. So creating new programs, support services in order to encourage energy efficiency, renewable energy, clean transportation, clean heating, and energy storage. These are all going to be essential components of attaining the Act on Climate goals. The EC4 does not have a dedicated funding source right now, and if we are sincere about making sure that we hit these targets, we need to make sure that EC4 is resourced. Next slide. A few items on local and education aid. It fully funds the next year of the car tax phase out, so fully funding I believe the 5th year of the phase out and reimbursing cities and towns for that amount. The next item has to do with the funding formula. The governor fully supports fully funding the education funding formula. There is one modification, and it has to do with enrollment. So as many of you know, during the pandemic, enrollment in public schools has gone down. Parents have kept people out of schools, but sometimes this is going to be a temporary effect. So we want to make sure that cities and towns and school districts are not harmed by that decision, especially if those children are going to come back. So there is about a $50 million transition fund to make sure that if a city or town or a school district would experience a loss in education funding formula because of a drop in enrollment, they would get to have at least the amount that they had in the prior year, fiscal year 22. And then a few other items in the fiscal year 23 budget. The governor proposes phasing out state tax on military retirement benefits over 5 years. As he mentioned in the State of the State, he proposes extending postpartum Medicaid coverage for new mothers from the current 60 days to 12 months, and making sure that all mothers are included irrespective of immigration status. He also proposes increasing, covering all children through the state Medicaid program, including children who would not be otherwise eligible because of immigration status. Recognizing the challenges that our providers, our healthcare providers, and our own state facilities are experiencing with attracting and retaining a healthcare workforce, the governor proposes expanding the Wavemaker Fellowship specifically for healthcare professionals, providing loan forgiveness, student loan forgiveness in the amount of $4,000 per year over 2 years to 100 healthcare professionals. The governor has proposed, as he mentioned in the State of the Union, assistance to small farms through the Local Agricultural and Seafood Act grant, so that would be a total of $250,000. And the governor, again, has proposed adult use marijuana legalization. This is very similar to the proposal he had last year. One difference is that it would include automatic expungement for people who have records related to marijuana. As I think many people know, this is an ongoing conversation between the General Assembly and the governor's office. We do expect there to be some legislation. We do not have that finalized yet, so in the meantime, we wanted to make sure that there was something recognizing that there would be some type of adult use marijuana proposal going forward. So we have we included that language here. And turn it back to Joe.
I think the last slides are fairly technical, and I won't bore you with all the details, but they'll be useful for your reference. So here are expenditures by source. You'll see that the budget modestly declines in the recommended budget, the 23 recommended budget over the 22 revised. 22 revised, we actually did add some funding to, and that's largely due to the fact that a lot of those one-time investments that I had referred to, we did request those in the current year rather than in 23. So you'll see that the governor's budget adds money to both the 22 budget as well as requests funding in 23 for many items. The 23 budget is lower than it otherwise would have been because, as Brian showed, the $1.13 billion of state fiscal recovery fund spending is requested over a multi-year schedule. On the next slide, it just provides some detail on state general revenues. As I said, you'll notice that the fiscal 22 general revenue request is up, and that's because it's where we put a lot of the one-time requests. There's a simplified version of the surplus statement on the next slide that shows how the money flows from one year to the next and is there for your reference.
What was the purpose of kicking those one-time expenditures into the current fiscal year?
It recognized on something like the RICAP transfer, it keeps it out of the base, so to speak. So it lets 23 be somewhat of a more realistic or accurate depiction of what ongoing expenditures are. And some of the expenditures are requested in 22 because they're actually needed in 22. There are a handful of revisions like that. But for many of those, like transfer to ITIF or funding RICAP, putting it in 22 just ensures that it will be available as soon as possible and keeps it out of the base going forward.
I want to take you back to the small business package, page 20. What's your cost estimate for effects on cost? This is the corporate minimum tax.
Sure. I have individual estimates on each of them. I know that aside from the reenactment of the hospital licensing fee, the net revenue impact of the governor's budget is a $3.1 million reduction in revenue statewide. That is a couple of increases. There's a couple of small increases. The most notable increase is the increase related to medical marijuana. But then there are also the handful of cuts. So I can get you the specific impact on some of the most significant, which include the veterans phase out, the interest rate cut.
Does the surplus mean that there's not a deficit for fiscal 22?
So that's the final slide. The final slide shows the 5-year forecast. And that is the challenge and the contradiction that we're facing, that we're sitting on lots of one-time money, yet the out years remain out of balance. You'll notice a couple things with this slide. The situation has improved dramatically since last year. So the dotted line shows the surplus that we had forecast in last year's governor's recommended budget. I'm sorry, the deficit that we had forecast in last year's governor's recommended budget. And you'll see that that line does come down. A notable feature of that line is that it remains downward sloped. That's something that's unique. Over the past 10 or 20 years, we've often faced ballooning out-year deficits. And the fact that on the operating side, this is a relatively constrained budget has kept that in check. Next year, we face the last major step in the motor vehicle excise tax phase-out. That helps to constrain out-year growth. And additionally, both taking a constrained approach to the operating budget and a handful of out-year savings items help to keep it constrained.
So this starts in fiscal '23. Is there a deficit for fiscal '22?
There is, if you go back one slide, you'll see that we'll close fiscal '22 with $135.5 million that will roll into '23, and then we'll close with $8 million on the bottom line.
Sure. And I believe the last time lawmakers started a new session without a deficit was in Governor Almond's second term. Can you specify what year that was?
I can take a look. We have compiled a large number of the out-year deficit forecasts. So you're asking for the last time that we entered a legislative session without facing a deficit to close. Yeah, we can look into that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Maybe you answered part of this question, but a lot of people are going to see all this money coming in, apart from those business tax changes. Why no lowering of income tax or sales tax?
I think that the governor, in a perfect world, would love to have done something like that. I think he took a realistic approach that we had a lot of one-time funding. He wanted to make the targeted cuts that he had. He knew that this was neither a time for tax increases to balance the budget or major expenditure reductions to balance the budget. And I think that he took a responsible but realistic approach in doing what he could.
Joe.
Go ahead.
It's also provision of the state fiscal recovery funds that they cannot be used to reduce taxes.
Pat and then Patrick. Sorry, but there's not enough room if we're having all that money to take care of some other things. The $600 million surplus, there's still not enough room.
It gets very technical. What Joe said applies. What I said applies as well.
I'm sorry, I may have missed it. In terms of the medical cannabis tax, what are you budgeting? Are you actually increasing the rate in this budget? And what are you actually looking at as budgeted revenue for the next fiscal year?
In terms of the adult use, we're expecting $1.189 million of revenue for adult use in the first year. That ramps up to about $16 million in the out year. In the first year, we're also expecting some revenue loss due to forgiven fees associated with expungement, and that's in the $300,000 to $400,000 range. I'd have to get back to you. I don't believe that we're proposing any major changes with medical, but let me confirm that.
Do you have an estimated budget amount for what you expect from strictly tax and fees on medical?
I have that. I don't know it off the top of my head, though.
Patrick and then Eli.
Do think bouncing off of that, where are we on marijuana? This seems like Groundhog Day. We're constantly trying to legalize marijuana and yet it doesn't happen. Is this just a placeholder and the details are to be determined in legislative talks? Do you have any idea what it's actually going to look like?
It's a great question. So I wouldn't refer to it as a placeholder because I think there are components of this that the governor feels very strongly about, including the expungement component, as well as making sure that the Department of Business Regulation has a role. But these are conversations that are going on right now with General Assembly leadership and the governor's office. We've heard indications that there may be some action coming forward. We didn't want to pretend it wasn't going to happen in the budget, so we wanted to make sure that there was some recognition, even though, as Joe mentioned, the revenues that we expect in fiscal year '23 are relatively small. We weren't using them for, to balance the budget, but we wanted to recognize that we did expect some type of proposal.
And the second thing, do you have a total of the full estimated cost of all of the union contract increases that have either been approved or are expected in the next fiscal year?
We do have that. We can provide that offline. It's there because there's a retro component. It's broken out by year, so we can give you the information by the years.
That would be great.
We also have several contract negotiations outstanding.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eli.
Just have a couple questions on Eleanor Slater.
Joe.
The plan here is to build a new facility at the Zambrano campus. Does that replace the existing building? And if so, what's the plan for the structures that are there now?
So we have Director Charest from the BHDDH, if you'd want to talk to him. He has a lot more operational detail, who could talk about the scope of that project.
Okay, and then on the funding side, if you're splitting the hospital into two and creating a standalone psychiatric hospital, what are the implications for funding? As I understand it, forensic patients are not reimbursable by federal funds, so how are we going to pay for it?
Yeah, Joe might have more information, but one of the reasons to do that is to make sure that we don't have this issue we've had in the past of trying to watch the patient balance. It does open up a lot more opportunities for Medicaid reimbursement. We have included some of those in the budget. Joe can speak.
Yeah, and the short answer is we are not expecting federal participation on the psych side in the short term, or long term for that matter. But the current plan does not expect federal participation at the state psychiatric hospital, but it does expect continued Medicaid reimbursement or a resumption of Medicaid reimbursement next year for the medical side of the hospital.
Under the umbrella of an LTAC, I mean, are you changing the designation of the hospital in Burville?
Right now, our assumption is that Eleanor Slater Hospital remains an LTAC, and Director Charest can give some more details on exactly how that plan will work.
Thank you.
Can we go back to marijuana for 1 second? What exactly are the crimes that you would automatically expunge?
I have to double check that. We'll get back to you on that stuff.
Okay.
Where does developmental disabilities stand in this budget? The department requested about $43 million, $44 million more to give the workers $18 an hour. And there are some deadlines coming up with, in terms of compliance for the consent decree. They also requested ARPA funds, and I haven't heard them mentioned at all.
Yep, so the budget fully funds all the components of the consent decree action plan, including the wage increases. The 5-year forecast also assumes the additional wage increase that will happen in 2024. It assumes that the recurring portions of the consent decree action plan continue to be funded, and the source of funds for those investments are a combination of regular Medicaid eligible federal and state split, enhanced HCBS FMAP reimbursement. That's that special pool of funds that was provided by ARPA. And in addition, some of it will be GR funded because it's not otherwise eligible for Medicaid match. So it'll be a GR, general revenue.
Oh, general revenue, I'm sorry.
Yep, so it's unfortunately kind of a complicated mishmash of funding because some of it is that enhanced FMAP, some is normal Medicaid, and some is general revenue. But it will have an impact this year, next year, and the year after in terms of increases and ongoing commitment.
All right, we'll take a couple more questions. Pat?
Sure. Department of Corrections is an area which has elicited a great deal of controversy over the last few years, as well as recently a spate of lawsuits, both federal and local. Is there significant changes in the corrections budget, and by what method with a department like that that is so turbulent do you accrue for potential litigation and lawsuits?
With respect to some of the long-term goal of creating a step-down facility within, I want to make sure I use the correct terminology, referring to the ensuring that individuals with mental health, facing mental health issues or behavior issues are dealt with appropriately in the prison. We are continuing funding for $750,000 of planning to make sure that is dealt with appropriately. And they're working on a proposal for a separate unit within their facility that would deal with the behavioral problems.
One very quick follow-up. Legislation was presented this past year by Senator Mack and a number of other folks sponsored it that would have closed the High Side facility, which is often referred to as the place where solitary confinement takes place. That would result in significant savings, ironically, to the state. Was that considered in the budget at all?
So that's where we continue to fund the planning money to come up with a plan to have closing that facility would be only part of a plan. I'm not saying that is a plan. There's not a specific plan there, but coming up with an appropriate unit to house those inmates would need to be part of the plan. And there's not a specific plan in the budget for that, but I think we have $750,000 of recurring funding for that.
Great, thank you.
Last one. Patrick. What is a smart bay, and is there anyone who can unpack a little bit of what the blue economy stuff actually is, tangibly speaking?
Secretary Pryor, he smiled behind his mask. I could tell. He would be happy to talk to you about that. But the general concept is understanding that that our bay provides us a lot of opportunity to do research and development and testing of new technologies. A smart bay is an idea of putting sensors underwater so that as you're testing new technology, you can find out the impact of that technology. So Secretary Pryor would be happy to talk about that because it's almost like a lab space, but being able to have sensors and ways of determining the effectiveness of new technology.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all.